Thomas and Emily Harris vanished just days after returning from their honeymoon. No note, no signs of struggle, only their car left abandoned near a forest trail. For 20 years, their disappearance remained a mystery. Then, a hidden surveillance. Tape was found buried beneath an old ranger outpost. What it revealed changed everything. This wasn't just a missing persons case. It was a truth someone had worked hard to keep buried. And now, after 2 decades in silence, their story is finally ready to be told. Asterisk, in the summer of 1999, Thomas and Emily Harris stood beneath an arch of hand-picked wildflowers on the lawn of Emily's childhood home in Vermont, sunlight dancing off the folds of her ivory dress as a breeze whispered through the maple trees. They were both in their late 20s, brimming with that special kind of optimism that only comes when 2 people believe, truly believe, that their love will carry them through anything. The ceremony was small, intimate, filled with laughter, and tears and promises whispered between joined hands. They weren't wealthy, but what they had felt richer than anything money could buy, a connection forged from years of friendship and kindled into something deeper with time. Their honeymoon was to be modest, just a week away in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, but to them, it might as well have been Paris in the spring. It was their time, their adventure, their beginning. They packed up Thomas's old green Chevy pickup with a few bags, a basket of wedding leftovers from Emily's mother, and a second-hand camcorder Thomas had bought with money he'd saved delivering newspapers as a teenager. That camera became their time capsule. As they drove south, they filmed everything. Emily singing off-key to Fleetwood Mac, Thomas narrating like a game show host as they passed through winding back roads, and both of them laughing till their sides hurt over the smallest things. When they arrived at the rustic cabin nestled near the forest's edge, they were awestruck by its beauty. It was quiet, secluded, the kind of place where the stars seemed closer and the world fell away. They called their parents the first night, sent a postcard the second, and by the third day, they simply disappeared. When the Harrises failed to check out of the cabin as scheduled, the rental office tried calling but got no answer. A maintenance man was sent to knock. Inside, he found the cabin empty but undisturbed. 2 half-drunk cups of coffee on the porch railing, an open journal on the kitchen table, and the camcorder left sitting on the dresser, battery dead. Their truck was still parked outside. There were no signs of struggle, no note, no indication of where they had gone or why. Within hours, a search was launched, with park rangers, local volunteers, and dogs combing the woods in widening circles. Helicopters flew low over the dense canopies. Every hiker in the area was questioned, but there was nothing. It was as if the mountains had swallowed them whole. For weeks, the story dominated the local news. Newlyweds vanish on honeymoon. The headlines read, accompanied by smiling wedding photos and shaky clips from the recovered camcorder, Thomas dancing in the kitchen, Emily blowing a kiss to the lens. People were captivated by the mystery and heartbroken by the tragedy. How could 2 people disappear so completely, so silently, in the middle of their honeymoon? Speculation ran wild. Some believed they had simply gotten lost. Others feared foul play. And still others suggested they had run off to start a new life, though those who knew them insisted that was impossible. They were in love. They had plans. They had people waiting for them back home. Emily's parents never stopped hoping. Her mother kept the porch light on every night for years. Her father reread her last postcard until the ink began to fade. Thomas's family, more pragmatic, held a quiet memorial after 5 years, choosing to accept what seemed inevitable. But to those closest to the couple, the wound never fully closed. There was no closure, no answer, just a void where 2 lives had once been so full of promise. Time moved on, as it always does, but the absence remained like a shadow just behind the eyes dot by 2020. The case had become a cold file buried in the sheriff's archives, remembered only by a few aging locals and the families who carried the weight every day. The cabin still stood, mostly forgotten, its wooden walls grayed by time, a silent witness to whatever had happened that fateful week. No one went near it anymore, not out of fear, but out of respect, like approaching a grave. The forest had reclaimed much of the trail leading to it. It was as though nature itself had drawn a curtain over the story, urging the world to forget. But stories like these don't stay buried forever. Sometimes they wait, quietly, until someone stumbles upon the thread again, pulling at it gently, unknowingly unraveling what time has tried to hide. And that's exactly what happened when a widow cleaning out her late husband's belongings came across a dusty old box marked with a shaky hand. Private. Do not open. Inside was an old camcorder with a cracked lens and a rusted battery compartment. She nearly tossed it away with the rest of the junk. But something made her hesitate. A feeling, a whisper from the past. And when she finally pressed play on the grainy, distorted footage, the image that flickered on the screen sent chills down her spine. It was a man and a woman. Young, nervous. The woman had long chestnut hair and wore a floral sundress. The man stood in front of her, protective, tense. Another figure stepped into frame holder, in uniform. A conversation started, muffled and fragmented, but one thing was unmistakable. The woman's voice, trembling, barely above a whisper. "We don't want any trouble. Please, just leave us alone." And just like that, the story that had been silent for 20 years began to speak again. The box sat on Rachel Monroe's desk like a ghost from another life, its corners softened with age, the label nearly unreadable. She had found it tucked away in the far back of the sheriff's archives, beneath years of forgotten reports and yellowed evidence logs. The sticker read simply, "Harris Case, 1999. Most deputies in the office barely remembered the name. But Rachel, now nearing the end of a long and often thankless career, had been a rookie deputy when the call first came in. She remembered standing outside that weathered Honeymoon cabin as search dogs barked and men shouted into the woods, her notebook clutched tightly in trembling hands. She had no idea then how that case would settle like dust in the corners of her memory, untouched but never truly gone. Now, 20 years later, the town had changed. The faces in the department were younger, and Rachel found herself organizing files not for a new case, but for retirement. She'd been given 2 months to train her replacement and box up her life's work. She'd started with the old cold cases, wanting to see what might still be worth another look. When she found the Harris file again, something tugged at her, an ache, a flicker of unfinished business. She opened the box and leafed through the photos first. Emily's bright smile, Thomas's goofy expression as he held up their wedding rings to the camera. Then came the reports, the aerial maps, the hiker interviews, and finally, the tape log. Camcorder recovered from cabin. Tape inside blank battery dead. It struck her then. The tape had never been reviewed thoroughly. Technology had been more limited then. Perhaps they had tried to play it and dismissed it when nothing loaded. She made a note to check it. That was when Margaret Pierce walked in. The widow had a slow shuffle and eyes that seemed older than her years. She said her late husband, Walter, had worked as a forest ranger until 2005. After he passed the previous fall, she'd begun cleaning out the attic. She wasn't sure why she'd waited so long. It just didn't feel right until now. There, in a box marked Private Due. Not open. She had found an old Sony camcorder. At first, she almost threw it out. But when she turned it over, she noticed a faded label stuck to the side that read, September 1999, Ridge Trail. Something about it gave her pause. She charged it overnight, and the next morning, nervously pressed play. What she saw made her hands shake, A young woman and man on a cabin porch. Tension in the air. A third man, older, in uniform. A few words she could barely make out. Something about being left alone. The recording cut out after less than 2 minutes, but Margaret couldn't stop thinking about it. She hadn't recognized the couple, but she knew it wasn't something she could keep to herself. So she brought it to the only person she trusted. To understand the weight of it, Sheriff Rachel Monroe. Rachel watched the footage in stunned silence. The quality was grainy, but it was enough. She knew that porch. She knew those faces. She played it 3 more times before turning to Margaret and asking, "Where did you say your husband worked again?" Margaret nodded slowly. Blue Ridge National Park. South Lookout Post. Retired after a back injury. Rachel thanked her and promised to follow up. As Margaret left, Rachel sat back in her chair, the camcorder still in her hands, heart racing. After 2 decades, something real had surfaced. And that something had been hidden intentionally or not by a man who had access to those woods, who wore a ranger's uniform, and who had never once come forward with what he'd seen the next day. She sent the tape to a specialist in Asheville, who had the equipment to extract corrupted video. It would take a few days. In the meantime, Rachel reopened the file in earnest. She reviewed every statement, every diagram, every photo. So much had been missed in the frenzy of those early days, so much left unasked. She pulled out the original Ranger duty rosters, buried in a faded folder near the bottom of the box. There he was, Dale Kincaid, badge number 1472, assigned to the Southern Patrol Zone during the exact week the Harrises vanished. A handwritten note next to his name read, "Transferred 2000 early retirement. No explanation. No follow-up. She typed his name into the department database. No outstanding records. No red flags. A quiet exit from a quiet man. But she had a feeling now. A feeling that something about Dale had gone unnoticed back then. She scribbled his name on a sticky note and circled it twice. Rachel wasn't one to chase ghosts, but this didn't feel like chasing. This felt like the ghost had just walked. Through her door when the restored footage arrived the following week, Rachel shut her office door and played it alone. The quality was sharper now. She could hear the wind in the trees, a bird chirping in the background. Thomas stood close to Emily, shielding her slightly. Dale Kincaid's voice was firm but not loud. "You can't be here past dusk. Park policy." Thomas replied, "We checked in with the rental office. We're not doing anything wrong." Dale took a step closer. "I said it's not safe. These woods aren't what they used to be." Then Emily's voice, trembling, "We don't want any trouble. Please, just leave us alone." The tape ended there. But the silence it left behind was deafening. Rachel sat back slowly, goosebumps rising on her arms. After all these years, they had never truly left her. Thomas and Emily had always been there, in the files, in the photos, in the unanswered questions. And now, in a piece of tape that had waited 20 years to be heard, they were speaking again. She turned the camcorder off, stared at the name she had written on the sticky note, and whispered to herself, "All right, Dale, let's find out what you were really doing up there." The wind that afternoon had the feel of early fall cooler, quieter, brushing the windows of the sheriff's office with a kind of softness that made Rachel Monroe pause before returning to her desk. She'd barely sat down when she noticed the older woman standing quietly by the door, clutching something to her chest as if it were both precious and painful. She didn't ask for anyone. She didn't demand attention. She simply stood, waiting, her shoulders stooped not just from age but from something heavier, something invisible. Rachel recognized that kind of weight. She'd seen it before in grieving mothers, in siblings who had waited decades for answers that never came. With a gentle nod, Rachel stood and motioned her in. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Pierce, her voice soft but steady. She explained that her husband Walter had passed away the previous November after a slow decline from Parkinson's. Walter had been a forest ranger, assigned to the southern end of Blue Ridge National Park in the late 1990s, and had kept mostly to himself in retirement. A quiet man, meticulous about his tools, his journals, his secrets. They had lived a simple life in a little white house with peeling shutters and a backyard garden where Walter liked to sit in the evenings, whittling wood into small animals he never showed anyone. After his death, Margaret had begun the long, slow process of sorting through his things. It was like walking through someone else's memories, boxes of hiking maps, old boots, stacks of handwritten reports no one had read in years. And then she found the camcorder it had been tucked in the bottom drawer of a locked cabinet in the garage, stored in a shoebox with a faded note that read, "Private. Do not open." She had merely honored that request, feeling like she was intruding on something sacred, or perhaps shameful. But something made her look. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was grief's way of pulling at loose threads. When she opened the box, she found the camcorder and an old backup battery wrapped in a kitchen towel. The casing was scratched, the lens slightly fogged, but the tape inside was still intact. Margaret didn't have the heart or the technology to view it herself. She didn't want to see what her husband had hidden, but she also couldn't bear to destroy it. And so she brought it here, hoping someone else could carry whatever truth it held. Rachel accepted the camcorder with careful hands, already knowing in her bones what it might contain. She'd seen the clip earlier that week, the restored footage of Thomas and Emily, the ranger in the background, the pleading voice. But something Margaret said chilled her more than the tape itself. She described Walter coming home late on September 25th, 1999. Nearly midnight, mud on his boots, a strange look in his eyes. He didn't speak much that night. He just showered, ate dinner in silence, and went to bed early. For weeks afterward, he was on edge quiet even for him. He told Margaret he'd seen something out in the woods, something he couldn't explain, and that some people just shouldn't wander off trail. She thought nothing of it then. Rangers said odd things sometimes, especially when they were tired or spooked by animals. But now, looking back, she wondered. She wondered a lot. Rachel gently asked if Walter had ever mentioned the Harris couple. Margaret shook her head. Not once. Not their names. Not their story. But after finding the footage, she'd begun searching online, trying to place the faces. And there, in an old article, she found them. The same couple from the video. The same ones who vanished. That's when she knew she couldn't keep this to herself. She had to speak, no matter what it meant. Rachel thanked her and promised to handle everything with care. She watched as Margaret walked away down the hallway, her footsteps soft but deliberate, as though leaving something behind she'd been carrying far too long. Alone again, Rachel sat with the camcorder on her desk, heart beating just a little too fast. There were so many questions now, ones that couldn't be ignored. Why had Walter never come forward? Had he been protecting someone? Himself? Or had he simply been too afraid? And what else had he seen that night in those woods? She played the tape again. The sound of the wind, the rustle of leaves, the quiet tension of two people standing their ground while someone loomed just beyond the frame. It wasn't long, barely 90 seconds, but every time Rachel watched it, she noticed something new. A hand gesture, a glance, a shadow moving just out of focus. It didn't feel random. It felt rehearsed, like a warning. And the fact that Walter had held on to it all these years made it clear he hadn't forgotten. He hadn't forgiven himself either. That night, Rachel took the file home with her. She sat at her kitchen table under the soft glow of a single lamp, reading through the original reports again, this time with sharper eyes. A pattern was beginning to emerge: ranger patrol logs that didn't match up, visitor reports that had gone missing, a complaint from a hiker dated 2 days before the Harris disappearance that had been filed but never followed up. Each piece alone meant little, but together they whispered of something deeper, something buried. As she flipped through the pages, her phone buzzed with a message from the forensic specialist. Finished reviewing the tape. Sending cleaned up audio and enhanced video tomorrow. You'll want to see this. Rachel put down her pen and looked out the window, past the porch, and into the shadows stretching across her backyard. She'd seen many strange things in her time, heard many stories that defied logic. But this one had waited 20 years in silence, and now, like a wound reopening, it was starting to bleed. She didn't know yet what the truth was, but she knew one thing for certain. The Harris case wasn't finished, and neither was she. The next morning brought a crisp stillness to the town, the kind that seems to pause everything, even time. Rachel arrived early, coffee in hand, her mind already a whirlpool of memories, suspicions, and fragments of a story that no longer felt like a mystery, but a puzzle whose pieces had been scattered too far for too long. She opened her office door and found a padded envelope waiting on her desk, the forensics lab seal on the corner, and her name handwritten across the front. She knew what it was before opening it: the restored tape. The forgotten tape. She plugged in her laptop and slipped in the USB drive they'd enclosed, heart thudding like a slow drumbeat. The file opened to a still frame from the cabin's porch, wooden railing in the foreground, trees in soft focus behind. The footage began with the sound of footsteps on gravel, then Thomas's voice, calm but firm, saying, "We're just here for the week. We paid for the cabin." Then came Dale Kincaid, just visible in the corner, stepping into frame with the slow certainty of a man used to authority. His ranger uniform was wrinkled, hat low on his brow, voice sharp. "I know the area." "You shouldn't. Stay past sundown," he said. "These woods ... they have rules." Emily stepped into view behind Thomas, her hand brushing his arm as if asking him not to provoke. "We don't want any trouble," she said gently. "We just want to enjoy our trip." Dale looked at her for a long moment, then said something too low to make out. His eyes, even in the blurry video, held something unreadable. The footage ended there. But in that short exchange, something was clear. He wasn't just offering a warning. He was delivering something colder, darker, a threat disguised as concern. Rachel replayed it twice, then focused on the enhanced audio file. The forensic team had managed to isolate background noise and amplify speech. And for the first time, she could clearly hear what Dale had said to Emily in the last second before the tape cut out. "Then don't go looking where you're not supposed to." It sent a shiver up her spine. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, like someone who wasn't bluffing, someone who'd made people disappear before, or at least believed he could. She closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. 20 years ago, someone had written this tape off. It had been logged as blank, forgotten in a file box that no one opened again. That decision had cost the case everything. If they'd seen it then, would they have followed Kincaid? Would they have questioned him more thoroughly? Or had someone deliberately buried it? She didn't want to believe there'd been a cover-up. But part of her did wonder who had reviewed that footage in '99? Who had decided it showed nothing? Rachel returned to the old evidence logs and cross-referenced the video entry. The original report had been written by a deputy named Carl Beasley, now long retired and living downstate. She found his number through the sheriff's pension office and called him. His voice, though roughened by age, still carried the echo of authority. When she asked about the Harris tape, there was a pause, too long to be casual. "That old thing?" he said finally, It wouldn't play back then. Battery was dead. We noted it, but figured it wasn't important. Rachel pressed. Had anyone tried restoring it? Back then? Carl scoffed. You think we had fancy tech? We didn't have the budget for that. If it didn't play, it didn't matter. Anyway, the case was cold before we even got close to figuring it out. Too many miles, too many trees. But Rachel could hear it in his tone: regret, maybe even guilt. Before he hung up, he added, You think there was something on that tape, don't you? She hesitated, then said, I know there was. He sighed, long and tired. Then I guess I missed it. I'm sorry. She ended the call and stared out her office window. The past wasn't just a collection of facts. It was a living thing, made of choices and mistakes, and sometimes silence. She thought about Margaret Pierce again, about Walter keeping that copy all these years. Why had he saved it if he didn't intend to show it? Was he trying to protect himself, or was he too scared of what it meant? And then a darker possibility came to her. What if Walter hadn't been the only one who knew? She pulled up the park's staffing records from 1999, tracing who worked alongside Dale Kincaid. There were 2 others listed that summer: Ranger Linda Capps and Ranger Brent Holloway. Brent had died in a climbing accident in 2002. Linda had retired just 3 years ago and was living in Tennessee. Rachel made a note to contact her, though her gut told her that anyone still alive from that patrol rotation had long since buried the details, either by fear or by choice. The tape, forgotten for 2 decades, had returned like a whispered memory, demanding to be heard. It wasn't just a clue. It was a key, a small window into what really happened that week in the woods. The authorities had missed it once. Rachel wouldn't make the same mistake. Not again. Not with the truth this close. The forest had hidden the couple. The people around them had hidden the rest. But now, finally, something was starting to come into focus. The more Rachel looked into Dale Kincaid, the more she felt a strange tightening in her chest, like pulling on a rope that had been buried deep in the earth and suddenly felt resistance. He hadn't left much behind, at least not in the formal records. His personnel file from the Park Service was remarkably thin for a man who had worked there nearly 12 years, 3 short pages. No disciplinary action, no commendations either. Just routine patrol logs, leave requests, and the brief note about his early retirement in January of 2000, citing personal health concerns. It was all too neat, too clean. People didn't just vanish from the paper trail like that unless someone had helped sweep it clean. She called the regional office of the National Park Service and requested any remaining documentation on Kincaid, using the pretense of preparing an anniversary report on unsolved wilderness incidents. They were slow to respond, but eventually a digital file arrived with copies of old evaluations and incident notes. One caught her attention immediately, a field report from July 1998, just 1 year before the Harris couple vanished. In it, a hiker named Jonah Rayner claimed to have been aggressively threatened by a ranger near the southern overlook for veering off trail. The ranger allegedly told him, "You go down that way, you might not come back." Rachel read that line 3 times. The report was closed without follow-up. No name of the ranger was listed, but based on the date and location, it almost certainly had to be Kincaid. She jotted the hiker's name into her notebook and ran it through local databases. After a few calls, she tracked Jonah down in Flagstaff, Arizona. He agreed to talk and sounded surprised that anyone still remembered the incident. On the phone, his voice was wary but clear. He told her he'd been backpacking solo that summer and had wandered off trail in search of a waterfall he'd read about in a local guidebook. That's when the ranger found him. He wasn't just warning me, Jonah said. He was threatening me. He had this ... way about him. Calm, but dangerous. Like someone who didn't need to raise his voice to make you scared. I backed off, apologized. He followed me all the way back to the main path and watched until I was out of sight. Rachel thanked him, her hand tightening around her pen. Jonah hadn't forgotten the encounter, not even after 20 years. Fear had a long memory. And it wasn't just him. Over the next 2 days, she found 2 more complaints lodged during Kincaid's final year on duty, one from a local teenager caught camping near an old fire road, and another from a woman who reported that a ranger had followed her car too closely for several miles on the way out of the park. All dismissed, all unsigned, all pointing to a man who had gone unchecked for years. She returned to the footage again, this time freezing on Dale's face as he stepped into frame. Even blurred and aged, there was something unsettling about the way he stood, like a man who knew that in the wild, rules meant little. His posture didn't speak of authority, it spoke of ownership. As if the woods were his, and those who entered were trespassers, no matter what the sign said. And if that was how he felt about random hikers, what would he have done to a couple who refused to leave? A couple who might have seen something they weren't meant to. Rachel drove out to the old ranger station at the edge of the southern trailhead, now used mostly for equipment storage. The building sat quiet under the shade of pines, its paint-chipped windows coated with dust. Inside, it smelled of mildew and age. She moved slowly, scanning the room for anything that might have been missed over the years. Then, in a back office drawer behind an old box of trail maps, she found a folder marked Patrol Notes, DK. Inside were handwritten logs, likely personal copies never filed officially. Most were mundane dates, trail conditions, wildlife sightings, but one entry stood out. September 26, 1999. Midday. Spoke to couple near Ridge Cabin. Refused to move camps. Said they'd stay all week. Logged their vehicle. May require follow-up. Nothing more. No further entries after that date. As if that had been his last patrol, Rachel stared at the page for a long time, then copied it and slipped the original back where she found it. Something had happened that afternoon. Dale had seen them, spoken to them, logged their presence. And then what? What kind of follow-up had he planned? She couldn't ask him now. Dale Kincaid had died 6 years earlier, a heart attack in his sleep in a trailer outside Asheville. No next of kin, no funeral. His belongings auctioned off by the state. He had lived the last years of his life as quietly as he'd left the Park Service. But in that quiet was the echo of something unfinished. Rachel stood in the doorway of the old ranger station, the air heavy with pine and memory, and looked out over the empty trail beyond. The path the Harris couple had taken was still there, still winding into the woods like a secret waiting to be told. Whatever happened back then, it hadn't been an accident. And it hadn't been random. It had the fingerprints of a man who knew the woods too well, who knew how to make things disappear, and who had spent a lifetime being just dangerous enough that no one dared to look too closely, until now. It had been over 2 decades since Rachel Monroe last set foot on the Ridge Trail, and yet the forest felt exactly the same ancient. Patient and full of secrets, it refused to give up easily. The narrow gravel road leading up to the southern overlook crunched beneath her tires. The same one Thomas and Emily had likely driven all those years ago, unaware that it would become the edge of their known world. She parked at the old trailhead just before noon, stepping out into air that smelled of moss and pine and something colder underneath, something time hadn't managed to scrub away. With her was only a backpack, a water bottle, a topographic map she had marked up with yellow highlighter, and a copy of Dale Kincaid's last handwritten patrol note, the one that ended with "may require follow-up." She had no illusions about how hard it would be to find anything after so many years. Trees grew, trails shifted, erosion worked its quiet magic, and memories bent in on themselves. But this wasn't about collecting evidence in the traditional sense. This was about retracing a path that had never been fully walked, about standing in the same places they had stood, hoping to see something no one else had bothered to look for. And perhaps more than anything, it was about listening, because the woods, like people, sometimes spoke only when you were finally ready to hear them. The hike to the ridge cabin site took over 2 hours, the trail growing steeper with every turn, switchbacks carving through dense thickets of rhododendron and mountain laurel. Occasionally, she would stop to catch her breath and listen. The forest was quiet this deep in the range, not the kind of silence that felt peaceful, but the kind that felt heavy. No breeze, no birdsong, just the distant creak of branches and the crunch of her boots. When she finally reached the clearing where the old cabin had stood, her breath caught in her throat. The structure itself was long gone collapsed, likely torn down for safety years ago, but the foundation stones remained, half swallowed by vines and moss. A few rotting boards jutted from the earth like ribs, and near what once had been the front steps lay the rusted remains of a folding chair, its fabric long decayed. She knelt beside it, brushing away leaves. The shape was right. It could have been the same chair seen in the camcorder footage. The porch where Emily had stood. The place where Dale Kincaid had first stepped into their lives. She walked slowly around the edge of the clearing, careful not to disturb too much. Just beyond the foundation was a faint path leading downhill, nearly overgrown but still visible to trained eyes. It wasn't on any map, just a narrow animal trail, or so it would seem, but Rachel's instinct said otherwise. She followed it carefully, ducking beneath low branches, stepping over twisted roots and old stones. After maybe 20 minutes, it opened onto a small hollow flat ground ringed with pines and a jagged rock wall rising behind it like a stage. The air was cooler here, still, as if sound refused to enter. And in the center of the hollow, half buried in pine needles, was something that stopped her breath entirely. A length of weathered rope. She crouched, reaching for it, heart pounding. It was too thick to be from a tent or hiking gear. Coarse, military grade, the kind used to secure something heavy. Or someone. She pulled gently, revealing more beneath the soil, but didn't disturb the sight further. This was enough. This was something. She took photographs from every angle, marking the location with GPS. Then, behind the rock wall, she noticed another detail. 2 shallow depressions in the earth, side by side. Almost indistinguishable unless you were looking for them. Old, but not forgotten. Her breath trembled as she stood, taking it all in. If someone had needed a place to hide something or someone, this is where they would have come. She stayed in the clearing for another hour, not moving, not speaking, letting the place tell her whatever it could. The forest doesn't forget. It only waits for the right person to ask the right questions. When she finally began the hike back down, the sky was beginning to darken. Sunset came quickly in the mountains, casting the trees in long, golden shadows. As she neared the trailhead, she stopped one last time and turned around, looking back toward the ridge. The air was silent again, but this time she didn't feel alone. Back at the station, she filed an official report, unearthed rope, disturbed. Soil consistent with potential grave sites, possible connection to 1999 missing persons case. She included the photos, coordinates, and requested a forensic team with ground-penetrating radar. It would take time. But now she had more than suspicion. She had a place, a presence. Proof that someone had stood in those woods with something terrible to hide. Rachel closed her file, locking it in her drawer, and sat quietly in her office long after everyone else had gone home. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting long pools of yellow across the pavement. Inside, The only sound was the quiet hum of the old refrigerator down the hall and the ticking of the wall clock above her door. She stared at the map still, pinned to her corkboard, the trail, the cabin, the hollow, and felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of truth. A truth buried deep in the mountains, wrapped in silence and pine in time. But not for much longer. The forensic team arrived 3 days later. Just after sunrise, their equipment packed into 2 dark SUVs that rolled up the old forest road like quiet sentinels. Rachel met them at the trailhead, the autumn wind tugging at her coat as she handed them printed maps, her notes, and the GPS coordinates she'd marked with such care. They didn't ask many questions. In their line of work, silence often meant more than words. The technician in charge, a gray-bearded man named Olin, examined the photos of the rope and the shallow indentations with a furrowed brow. "If the Earth's been disturbed," he said softly, "it'll tell us. Might not give us the whole story, but it'll remember." They began their hike in solemn procession, the GPR cart rolling behind them like a silent witness. The path was quiet again, just as it had been when Rachel walked it days earlier, but this time the silence held something else: anticipation. The forest didn't seem indifferent anymore. It felt alert, like it had been waiting for someone to return with the right kind of eyes. When they reached the hollow, no one spoke. The team spread out methodically, unpacking scanners and stakes, stretching yellow tape in a wide perimeter. Rachel stood back, heart pounding, watching as they moved the radar sled in tight parallel lines across the soil where the rope had been buried. Each pass took minutes. Each minute stretched into years. Then, near the far edge of the hollow, the machine gave a small sound, a faint beep, almost apologetic. Olin leaned over the screen, adjusted the frequency, ran the scan again. Another beep. He looked at Rachel. "We've got anomalies. 2 of them, about 4 feet deep. Uniform size, rectangular." He didn't need to say what that meant. She knew. Everyone there knew. The ground, long silent, was starting to speak up by the afternoon. The dig had begun. They worked slowly, carefully, layer by layer, brushing aside pine needles, scraping through soil that had settled like a secret over years of weather and time. The first discovery was a rusted zipper pull, small, broken, but still holding its shape. Then came fabric, faded and brittle, and beneath that, something pale and smooth that made everyone pause. Bone. Human. Rachel turned away for a moment, her breath catching. She had imagined this scene 100 times, but imagination was a fragile thing compared to the truth. She knew in her bones this was Emily, knew it in the soft echo of the wind through the trees, in the way the sunlight broke just so through the branches, casting long stripes across the earth like prison bars. The second grave told the same story. Male remains, larger, buried just beside the first. A wedding band still clung to the hand, dull but unmistakable. Rachel knelt beside it and whispered, "Thomas." There were no signs of animals, no drag marks. This had been deliberate, clean. 2 people laid side by side, like someone had taken the time to make sure they wouldn't be found, but still somehow kept them together. That strange cruelty, that twisted mercy stuck with her more than anything. When the bodies were fully recovered, the team gently bagged the remains, logging every artifact, every inch of disturbed ground. Olin came to stand beside her as the sun dipped below the ridge. "Hard to imagine they were up here all this time," he said. "So close, and no one ever thought to look." Rachel didn't answer. She was still watching the dirt, the empty spaces where 2 lives had once been. She thought about the camcorder, about Dale Kincaid's eyes in that grainy footage, about Walter Pierce hiding the copy in a box marked private. It had taken the earth to say what the people had refused to. Back at the station that evening, Rachel sat alone in her office, the blinds drawn, the evidence bag sealed and labeled, the photos printed and stacked in order. She didn't turn on the lights. The glow of her desk lamp was enough. She looked down at the two names she had written on the corner of her case file: Emily Harris, Thomas Harris. Then, below them, in a slower hand, she added Dale Kincaid. The pieces were all there now, lying side by side like the graves on that ridge. It wasn't enough to know what happened. She needed to understand why she returned to the logs from that summer. The journals, the statements, the long-buried reports. In the margins of Dale's personal notebook, she found a line that chilled her more than any bone or photograph. They saw it. They weren't supposed to. I warned them. God help me, I warned them. That single note changed everything. What had they seen? It wasn't just a matter of trespassing. It wasn't just defiance. There had been something else. Something Dale feared they would reveal. And whatever it was, he had taken it to the grave with him. Or so he thought. Rachel leaned back in her chair, the whisper of the trees still clinging to her ears. The ground had remembered what the people had tried to forget. Now it was her turn to give voice to what the forest had held in silence for far too long. She didn't know yet where the rest of the path would lead, but she knew this. The past was no longer buried, and once unearthed, it would demand to be heard. There was something about that stretch of forest, about the way the light filtered through the canopy and danced across the moss-covered floor, that made Rachel feel like time folded inward there. Like every footstep she took, pressed not only into soil, but into the past itself. With the remains of Thomas and Emily confirmed by the coroner's office 2 days later, the news spread quietly at first, just a local bulletin, a mention on the sheriff department's website. But Rachel knew it wouldn't stay quiet. Cases like this didn't lie dormant for 20 years only to fade again. The press would come. The questions would multiply, and every silence would demand explanation. But Rachel wasn't interested in press releases. She was still chasing the question that had kept her awake night after night since the moment she saw the footage. What had they seen? It was that single scribbled line in Dale Kincaid's notebook that haunted her most. They saw it. Not they did something. Not they resisted. They saw. That meant there was something in those woods Dale didn't want them or anyone to witness. Something he believed was dangerous enough to kill for. And it was that idea that kept clawing at the back of Rachel's mind like a branch against glass. She needed to know what it was. And if she couldn't ask Dale, she had to find someone who might still remember. She would turn to the list of names from the 1999 Ranger rotation. One stood out now more than ever: Linda Capps, the only other living Ranger from that summer. After several dead-end calls, she finally tracked Linda down in a small house just outside Chattanooga, Tennessee. The woman who answered the door looked nothing like the stern figure in the old staff photo. Her hair had gone silver, her back bent slightly with age, but her eyes were alert and wary, like someone who had spent most of her life watching the world a little too closely. Rachel introduced herself and explained the reason for her visit. At first, Linda said nothing, just motioned her inside and poured 2 cups of coffee without a word. They sat in silence until Rachel pulled out a copy of the cabin footage and placed it gently on the table. "Do you remember Dale?" Rachel asked. Linda's hands trembled just slightly as she lifted the photo. She looked at it a long time before nodding. "He was a hard man," she said finally. "Didn't like company. Didn't like questions." Rachel leaned in. "Did he ever talk to you about that couple, Thomas and Emily Harris?" Linda didn't answer at first. Then, her voice low, she said, "He mentioned them once. Said they were poking around where they shouldn't. Said he tried to send them off, but they were stubborn. I didn't think much of it then, but I remember the look on his face. He was spooked, Rachel's heart quickened. Did he say what they saw? Linda shook her head. No, but he hinted. He said something about old things being left where they should have stayed buried. I thought he was just rambling. He drank more near the end. Spent a lot of time on patrol, even when he wasn't scheduled. Once, I asked him what he kept looking for out there, and he said, "It's not what I'm looking for. It's what I'm keeping down." Rachel felt a chill crawl up her arms. She pressed on. Was there any place in the park he avoided? Linda hesitated, then reached for a piece of paper and drew a rough outline of the southern ridge. Her finger landed on a dense cluster of trees near the hollow. There. He hated that stretch. Said it didn't belong on the map. After Rachel left, she drove straight to the archives room at the county records office. She spent hours cross-referencing old land deeds and logging surveys, searching for anything out of place in the area Linda had pointed out. And then she found it, an old plat map from 1946, showing a structure deep in the woods. Labeled simply Outpost B, no road led to it. No record of its construction. But there it was, in faded ink, right near where Emily and Thomas had camped. Rachel's breath caught. Could that be what they had seen? Something left over from long before the park was open to the public? The next morning, armed with the map and her camera, she hiked back into the ridge alone. She moved slower this time, not just from fatigue, but from something heavier. An awareness that what she was walking toward was no longer just about solving a crime. It was about unearthing something someone had buried on purpose. As she neared the area Linda had marked, the trees thickened, the underbrush grew denser, and the trail all but disappeared. And then, through the pines, she saw a stone dot, just a sliver at first, then a low wall almost fully swallowed by ivy and decay. Rachel pushed aside the vines and found what looked like the corner of a stone foundation-cut granite, not native to the area. She walked around it slowly and found the remnants of what must have been a door frame, now half collapsed. Inside, there were only shadows and dust and the skeletal frame of what once had been a building. The walls were thick, too thick for a cabin, and in the back corner, half buried in dirt, was something even stranger, a metal hatch with a rusted handle. She knelt, brushed the debris away, and stared at it. Her reflection stared back in the metal's dull surface. Something had been down. There. Maybe still was. She didn't open it. Not yet. She stood slowly, heart racing, eyes sweeping the forest around her. There was no wind, no sound. Only the whisper of her own breath and the soft rustle of pine needles underfoot. And in that silence, she felt it again, that sense of being watched, of standing on a story that had never wanted to be found. Rachel didn't sleep that night. Her body was tired, but her mind raced with the weight of what she had discovered. The outpost wasn't just a ruin. It was a ghost, the kind that didn't appear in the dark, but one that lingered in silence, stone, and secrets left to rot beneath the pines. She sat at her kitchen table long past midnight, a dozen photographs spread out before her close-ups of the stone wall, the heavy hatch, the overgrown clearing. She studied every shadow, every corner, hoping one of them would speak. And somewhere, between the third and fourth cup of coffee, something clicked. In one of the frames, half hidden behind a tree root, she saw it, a patch of metal, a hinge. Not just any hinge, military grade. The same make she had seen once during a training seminar on Cold War-era fallout shelters. This wasn't a storage shed or an abandoned ranger station. It was something older, deeper, purpose-built. And now, very deliberately forgotten by morning, she made her decision. Whatever was beneath that hatch, it was time to open it. She contacted the county's emergency operations unit and explained the find, under the pretext of hazardous structure investigation. They sent a two-man crew with safety gear, portable lighting, and a battery-powered saw to break the rusted lock. Rachel hiked in with them, heart thudding with every step, as if her body already knew this would be the moment everything changed. When they reached the outpost, it was colder than she remembered. The sun filtered differently here, slower somehow, like light hesitated to touch this place. The crew worked in silence, their blades screeching against the corroded metal as they cut through decades of forgotten steel. When the lock gave way with a final, sharp snap, Rachel stepped forward and grasped the handle. The hatch creaked open with an agonizing groan, the scent of rust, soil, and stale air escaping like a trapped breath. A narrow staircase led downward, swallowed by shadow. Rachel clicked on her flashlight and began to descend. The air grew cooler with every step, heavy with the damp weight of time. At the bottom was a short corridor, walls lined with aged concrete, cracked and moss-streaked. To the left, an open room with rotted shelves and decayed boxes. To the right, another door, this one intact. She reached for the handle, but it resisted. Swollen with age. With a hard shove, it gave, and the door creaked open into a chamber no bigger than a garage. And that was where she saw it. A projector dot sat on a steel cart facing a blank wall. Nearby, reels of film were stacked in a metal cabinet, each marked with military codes and dates ranging from 1961 to 1973. A thick binder rested beside them, its pages brittle but legible. She opened it and skimmed the headings: behavioral, surveillance, containment protocols, unauthorized entry reports. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages, realizing this place hadn't just been a shelter. It had been a monitoring site for something or someone. Rachel called in the discovery and requested immediate historical record support from the state. While she waited, she photographed everything and brought one of the film reels back with her to town. The university's film lab agreed to help with the transfer. When she finally sat down to view the footage, her breath caught in her chest. Grainy black and white scenes flickered across the screen trees, wildlife, ordinary enough. Then a figure entered the frame. A woman. Hair in a bun, backpack slung over one shoulder, walking past the same rock outcrop Rachel had just hiked near days ago. A timestamp in the corner read June 4th, 1971. The reel continued, showing other hikers. Some appeared again in later footage, but a few did not. Most haunting of all was a final clip. Two people, a man and a woman, early 20s, setting up. Camped near the ridge. No sound, just movement. Then, out of the trees, three figures emerged. Not hikers, not rangers. Men in uniforms, faces hidden by gas masks. The reel ended as they surrounded the couple. Rachel sat frozen. Whatever this site had been, it had operated outside public knowledge. Surveillance, interventions, disappearances. Maybe the government had shut it down quietly. Maybe they had just walked away. But Dale Kincaid hadn't. He had been one of the last people stationed near the outpost. Maybe not as an official operative, but as someone who knew its past. Someone who believed he was guarding a secret. And when Thomas and Emily Harris stumbled into that forgotten corner of the woods, they hadn't just broken the rules of a park. They had crossed into history no one had ever been meant to see. That night, Rachel drove back to the overlook where the couple had taken their last photograph, the same view captured on their recovered camcorder before it all fell apart. She stood there as the wind picked up and the trees rustled like 100 quiet voices. She understood now. It wasn't just that they had seen something, they had seen too much. Enough to shake the foundation of what Dale had spent his life believing he was meant to protect. He hadn't killed out of rage. He had killed to preserve a silence someone else had engineered long before him. The truth was no longer just buried. In the ground dot, it had been caught on film, hidden beneath a forgotten hatch, whispered in the pages of an old binder, and guarded by a man whose conscience couldn't bear the weight of what he knew. Rachel didn't know yet how deep the roots of this story went, but she could feel them curling beneath the surface, twisting through history, policy, fear. She had found what Thomas and Emily saw. Now she had to decide what to do with it. Rachel had spent her entire career unraveling facts from fiction, testimony from truth. But nothing in her training, nothing in the decades she'd spent parsing lies in interview rooms and following cold trails through dusty records, had prepared her for the quiet horror she felt as she stared at the flickering footage from that reel. The images haunted her not just for what they showed, but for what they implied, that for years someone had been watching. Not from afar, not passively, but closely, with precision and purpose. And someone had made sure that whatever was being recorded never saw the light of day. She had to know who. There had to be a link between that footage and Dale Kincaid's obsessive patrols. Someone had taught him what to look for. Someone had once manned those cameras. And maybe, just maybe, someone was still alive. She went back to the binder found in the underground chamber, flipping past containment procedures and surveillance protocols until she landed on a personnel roster dated October 1972. Most of the names were unfamiliar. Long retired or passed on, but one leapt out: Gerald Avery, listed as Site Technician, Visual Operations. She circled the name, heart racing. A quick search turned up a possible match. Gerald Avery, age 87, listed in a senior care facility outside Denver. She called immediately, identified herself as a federal investigator, and asked for permission to visit. The nurse on the line said Gerald didn't speak much these days, but he still had his wits about him. He watches the same old TV shows, she added. But sometimes he stares off like he's remembering something he can't shake. Rachel booked a flight that afternoon. The facility was quiet, a modest brick building tucked between cottonwoods and aging sidewalks. Rachel was led to a room at the end of the hall, where an old man sat by a window, a wool blanket over his knees and a small black and white television humming quietly in the corner. His face was drawn, paper-thin skin folded along his cheekbones. But when Rachel introduced herself and said the words, "Ridge Outpost," his eyes sharpened like glass catching the light. He didn't speak right away, just reached slowly for a drawer beside his chair and pulled out a faded envelope. Inside were 3 black and white stills frame grabs from the very surveillance tapes Rachel had just seen. One was the couple. One was the gas-masked men. The third was of Dale Kincaid, younger, in ranger uniform, standing at the edge of a clearing with his back to the camera. "He knew," Gerald said finally, his voice hoarse. "He always knew." Rachel leaned forward. "You were the one who ran the tapes?" Gerald nodded. "For 15 years. We were told we were watching for environmental changes, movement patterns, even foreign aircraft. But that wasn't it. Not really. There was a section of forest, deep in the southern ridge, where things would happen. Things we weren't supposed to record, but we did. And when we did, we were told to mark the tape, seal it, and forget we ever saw it." Rachel felt a chill. "And Dale?" Gerald sighed, eyes unfocused. He was a true believer. He wasn't there when it started, but by the mid-'80s, he'd been assigned permanent coverage of that zone. Said he understood what the forest needed. Said he'd keep the balance. His voice cracked. I think he thought he was protecting people. But the longer he stayed, the more he changed. Rachel pulled out her own stills, showing Gerald the hatch, the projector, the logs. He studied them for a long time, then whispered, "I used to think we were just following orders, that it wasn't our place to question. But there was a File 1 tape that changed everything. I watched it alone one night. 2 hikers, a man and a woman. Not the Harrises, this was before them, 1973. They found something in the woods, a structure. Not ours, I saw them walk inside. I saw what they did. What happened? To them. He blinked, voice fading. And then the screen went dark. Rachel asked him if the tapes had ever been archived elsewhere, but he just shook his head. They were buried. Officially and literally. But Dale kept one. I think it was the Harris tape. I think he watched it every year. Like a ritual. Like penance. Rachel's pulse quickened. Do you know where he might have kept it? Gerald hesitated, then pointed toward the window. Trailer. Asheville. He had a crawl space under the floorboards. He told me once, years after he left the service, that if anyone ever came asking the right way, they'd find the truth where it was darkest. That night, Rachel drove straight to Asheville. The trailer park was still there, a crumbling row of single wides slouching beneath the shadow of the hills. She found Dale's old lot, overgrown and silent, the windows boarded, the porch sagging with age. But the lock was old, and with a quiet creak, the door gave way. Inside was dust, silence, and the smell of forgotten things. She found the floorboard Gerald had described beneath what remained of an armchair. It groaned under her hands, and then lifted out below it, wrapped in a towel and bound with tape, was a single film canister. She didn't breathe as she carried it. Back to her car. She didn't speak on the drive back to the lab. But when the film began to roll, and the sound of wind rustling through trees whispered from the speaker, she leaned forward and watched the truth begin to flicker into light. The reel ticked to life slowly, the soft click of the projector sounding like a heartbeat in the quiet lab. Rachel sat alone in the darkened room, her notepad forgotten on her lap, eyes fixed on the pale square of light blooming on the wall. The footage began the way most of the surveillance tapes did, wide shots of trees swaying in the breeze, a long stretch of empty trail, birds startled into flight. The timestamp read June 14th, 1999. Her breath caught. That was 3 days after. Thomas and Emily had last been seen. The angle changed. Now the camera was static, placed low to the ground as if hidden in a hollow or strapped to the trunk of a tree. She saw movement in the distance, 2 figures walking into frame. A man and a woman. Thomas wore a flannel shirt tied around his waist, and Emily had her hair pulled back beneath a blue bandana. They were laughing. You couldn't hear them, but you could see it in the way their bodies moved, relaxed and unaware. Rachel felt her chest tighten. This was the last time anyone would ever see them alive. The couple moved through the frame slowly, unaware they were being watched. They stopped near a tree, checked the map, then turned down a narrow side path. The camera didn't follow. Instead, the screen cut to black for a moment, and then a new angle appeared. Now the couple was closer, the trees darker. They had reached the base of a ridge, the same ridge where Rachel had found the old outpost. They were pointing at something just off-screen. Thomas moved forward first, pushing aside brush. Emily hesitated, then followed. The camera panned slowly. That's when Rachel saw it, a partial view of the old stone structure, the edge of the hatch just visible through the undergrowth. The footage froze for a second, then skipped. Static filled the screen briefly, then cleared. And suddenly, everything had changed. Thomas and Emily were no longer alone. 3 men stood behind them, figures in uniforms that didn't match Park. Rangers or local police. No visible insignia, no names. Their faces were obscured by gas masks, dark lenses and long filters making them look more like specters than people. Thomas stepped back, his hands up, confused. Emily tried to say something, her mouth forming words the camera couldn't catch. One of the men pointed toward the ground. Another stepped forward, grabbing Thomas by the shoulder. Emily turned too. Run, the screen flickered. For a heartbeat, it went black dot when it came back. Rachel covered her mouth. The scene had changed again. Now it was dusk, the light soft and gray. The camera had been moved. It pointed toward a small clearing, the same hollow where the bodies had been found. Two figures lay on the ground, still and quiet. The man in gas mask stood nearby. One held a shovel. Another lit a cigarette. There was no sound, no urgency, just routine. Like this was something they had done before, something they would do again. Rachel felt the bile rise in her throat. She wanted to stop watching, but she couldn't. The footage jumped once more. The final shot was the cabin. Not the outpost underground, but the ridge cabin where Dale Kincaid had confronted the couple days earlier. The camera was hidden behind a window pane, peering through a thin curtain. Inside, Emily sat at the table, her face pale, eyes puffy. Thomas stood near the door, pacing. Then Dale entered the frame. He said something. His hands slammed on the table. Thomas yelled. Dale stepped forward quickly. The screen jolted, the image tilted, and then everything froze in a single frame. Emily, looking toward the camera, straight at it, her face filled with terror. Then darkness. Rachel sat in the silence long after the reel stopped spinning. The room felt colder now, the air heavier. She rewound the tape and played it again, slower this time, watching each expression, each movement, looking not just at what happened, but what had been felt in those final moments. What struck her most wasn't the violence or the secrecy. It was the resignation. These people had known they weren't going to make it out. Somewhere between the ridge and the hollow, they'd realized they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd seen something that had been buried beneath the ground, beneath the bureaucracy, beneath the silence of a nation built on forgetting. And now, at last, someone had watched it, all of it. Someone who would not let it be buried again. She backed the reel into its case and locked it in the evidence cabinet, labeling it plainly, Harris footage classified. Recovery. Then she sat back down, this time with her notepad in hand. She wrote in long, steady strokes, a summary of the tape, the visual evidence, the timeline, the confirmation of Gerald Avery's account. She added details from the journal entries, the forensic report from the hollow, and Linda Capps' testimony. When she was finished, she stapled it together and placed it beside the film. It wasn't just a file anymore. It was a reckoning. The next morning, she contacted the Department of the Interior and requested a federal review. She had no illusions about what might happen. Investigations could vanish, files could be redacted, truth could be spun. But this time, there were bones in the ground. There was footage no one could unsee, and there was a name behind it, hers. She would not let this vanish like the others. Outside, the wind moved through the trees again, whispering through the leaves like a story long buried, now rising back into the light. The wind carried a chill that morning, the kind that seeps into your skin and settles deep into the quiet places of your bones. Rachel stood at the edge of the hollow where Thomas and Emily had been found, the trees bowing gently as if in solemn tribute. The excavation had been filled in weeks before, marked only by 2 simple stakes with red flags, pending official memorial designation. But to Rachel, it already felt like sacred ground, not because of how they died, but because someone had finally listened. After decades in silence, their story had risen like smoke from a dying fire, and now it would leave a mark the world couldn't ignore. The investigation had moved fast after the footage. Too fast, in some ways. Once the Department of the Interior received her file, federal agents swept in like a storm cataloging the tapes, sealing the chamber beneath the outpost, interviewing the last remaining staff linked to the site. Gerald Avery's testimony was taken by video. Linda Capps signed an affidavit, but no official statement was released. No press conference. No confirmation. It was as if the truth had reached the edge of something vast and invisible, only to be gently absorbed and muffled, like footsteps in snow. Rachel knew that tactic well. Bury it just deep enough to calm the waves, not deep enough to deny it. Exists. The difference, this time, was that someone had the full picture and had already made copies. The footage now lived in 3 secure locations. One with the Bureau, one with the County District Attorney, and one quietly, carefully with Rachel herself. Not because she planned to expose it to the media, not because she wanted fame, but because it belonged to the Harris family. And someday, when the time was right, they would need to see it not to relive the horror, but to finally understand why it had taken so long to bring their children home. She had visited them a week earlier. The parents were older now, smaller somehow, as if grief had slowly folded them inward. When Rachel told them that the remains had been found, they didn't cry. Not at first. They simply nodded, as if a piece of the air had shifted and the weight of not knowing had finally lifted. She didn't share the footage then. She couldn't, but she told them the truth in the only way that mattered. They didn't run away. They didn't leave each other. They saw something they weren't supposed to. And someone tried to make sure no one ever heard what they saw. But they stayed together, right until the end. Mrs. Harris had closed her eyes and whispered, "That sounds like them." And it did. Rachel thought about that moment now as she knelt in the dirt and placed a smooth river stone beside the 2 flag markers. She had carved it herself in her garage, using an old chisel and more patience than she thought she had. The letters were uneven, but the message was clear. Thomas and Emily Harris, together still. She pressed it gently into the soil, then stepped back. The wind stirred again, and she imagined the trees leaning in to read the words, nodding their ancient branches in quiet approval. Somewhere nearby, a hawk cried once, sharp and high, then vanished beyond the ridgeline. Rachel stayed for a long time, until the sun moved past noon and the shadows stretched long behind her. She didn't want to leave, but some part of her knew she didn't have to stay. The story no longer lived in the silence. It lived in the telling. Later that night, back in her office, she opened a new case file, not one marked with a number or a classification code, but with a name, Harris Ridge. It would contain her personal notes, a full timeline, annotated maps, and a copy of every statement. She wasn't sure if it would ever be read, but it mattered that it existed, that someone had carved it in ink as surely as stone, that someone had said, "This happened. This mattered." They mattered. In the drawer beside her desk was a small box. Inside it, the final item from Dale Kincaid's trailer. Not a weapon, not a map, but a letter. Handwritten, never mailed, dated 3 weeks before his death. It was addressed to whom it may concern, but the words felt like they had been written for her. "If you found this, then I didn't do enough. Or maybe I did too much. Either way, they never stopped watching. I only meant to warn them, not hurt them. But fear is a hell of a thing. It turns you into someone you don't recognize. If you're reading this, then I hope you're stronger than I was. I hope you bring them home." Rachel folded the letter back into the envelope. She wasn't sure if Dale deserved forgiveness, but she understood something now. He hadn't buried the truth because he hated it. He had buried it because he couldn't live with it. And now, someone else had. Outside her window, the trees swayed gently, no longer whispering secrets, just rustling like old friends saying goodbye. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the silence settle not with weight, but with peace. The truth had been found. The names had been carved out, and for the first time in 20 years, the ridge was quiet. For the right reasons. And so, after more than 2 decades lost in silence, the story of Thomas and Emily Harris finally found its voice, not in headlines or official reports, but in quiet places, a faded film reel, a broken ranger's guilt, a name carved in stone beneath the pines. What happened to them was never just about two people disappearing in the woods. It was about what we choose to forget and what refuses to stay buried. There's something haunting about a story that was never meant to be told. Something powerful in watching the truth claw its way back into the light, even after all those years. In the end, Rachel didn't just solve a mystery. She gave a family the gift of knowing, and she gave two lives the dignity of remembrance. For those of us who've ever waited by the phone, stared out the window hoping for news, or whispered someone's name long after the world stopped saying it, this story is for you. If you felt something during this journey, if it stirred a memory or made you think of someone you've lost, we invite you to share that in the comments. Your voice matters, because stories like this remind us no one truly disappears. If someone still remembers their name. Thank you for watching and staying with us until the very end. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing to the channel. We have many more true emotional journeys to share, stories that reach into the past to help us understand the present, and maybe even bring a little light to the dark places we'd rather forget. Until next time, take care of each other, hold your loved ones close, and never stop asking the questions that matter, because sometimes the truth is waiting just beneath the surface.